So hi, and welcome to my review of the Sigma 20mm f1.8 DG something. It's the one that's not an art lens, and that is very much apparent, as you're probably going to see. Now, I'm not going to be giving the most technical review that anyone's ever given. I'm going to be giving a relatively subjective view with what I think are real world pros and cons of why you would buy this lens. There are obviously newer, more expensive, better versions of this exact lens, and competitors to it, there are a few, but not too many, and that is part of what makes this lens interesting. I'm going to cover this lens as a full frame lens, primarily because I think that is what most people are going to be looking at this lens for. It may make sense to you as an APS-C user. I know that I've had some pleasure using it on my APS-C camera, but I'm going to primarily cover it as a full frame lens, but we are going to briefly touch on the video, which will be filmed on my 90D, which is obviously APS-C. So that's roughly what we're going to be doing. You're going to be seeing some example shots that I'm going to be taking using the lens on my 6D, and I'm going to edit those. You will be seeing them edited, but what you won't be seeing is I won't be providing any profile corrections or chromatic aberration correction. So none of the lens fixings that you would have in Lightroom. Even though Lightroom does have profiles for this lens, it is not that old that it doesn't have them, but I want to try and fairly represent what this lens doesn't do and where its flaws show. You know, you're always going to edit, but you're not always going to be able to profile correct. Obviously a profile correction is a physical loss in quality. You can't get that back. Now obviously sometimes that provides personality. I certainly have lenses which when I click the profile correction I feel the image becomes worse. Now maybe that's because I've become attached to the edit of the original version, which is wrong and bad, but ultimately I do think you can get attached to the look of a lens. Let's start seeing some pictures. We're here in this mad huge like celandine forest almost in this field. I was just cycling out looking for a good location, and this seemed pretty weird, so I thought better stop, get some photos here, and why not use it as a location. So I'm going to take a few photos here. You can have a look at these. I'm going to show some photos from recent failed attempts at videoing this same film, and we'll circle back for a few of the pros and cons of this lens. This is ridiculous. There's just a plant in front of me. So let's start off with some of the negatives about this lens. So it's really soft, especially wide open. At f1.8, as some of the test shots you'll probably be seeing are going to show, it's just not sharp. It can produce a sharp line, but not many of them. And if you're shooting something like the stars at night, you aren't going to get little pinpoint stars, not at f1.8. Another thing which is a bit of a deal breaker for me, well not a deal breaker obviously because I have it, but that massive front element and filter thread, more even than the front element. It's an 82mm front thread. Now if you're the kind of cheapskate who buys £100 lenses, this niche, you possibly aren't the kind of person who has 82mm filters. Now maybe you do, but for me, I invested in filters a couple of years ago. At the time I had a few nice lenses, and all of them were a 77 or a 72mm filter thread. So I went, I'm going to go all in on 77mm. I bought step-up rings for every single one of my other lenses which I used. I just mounted them on the lens permanently, and it just meant that I never had to worry about what filter thread. I just always knew that my lens was going to be a 77mm. I haven't tried stepping down, to be honest, but this lens vignettes like a... So I can't imagine that you'd want to add a stepped down filter to that mix. So if I want to break out my 10 stop and get some creamy water shots on like a dramatic wide open landscape, not going to happen. If I want to do that on a moving sky, which I might actually want to do, or even a long star trail starscape, it's not going to happen. So make that decision, possibly. One of the reasons why I bought the Canon 24-105 rather than the Sigma Art version was because of the 82 versus 77mm thread. Because I didn't want to buy a whole bunch new filters, which would add at least £100 more to the expense of buying a lens. And maybe for this one, it's going to be fine, because it's a niche lens that I'm possibly going to use more in the dark than I am in the sun. But for a 24-105, which you use all the time, no, I'm not going to put myself through that. So for a niche lens, maybe it's fine. For a not niche lens, I think it's probably something you would consider as part of your buying process. It vignettes like crazy. So you are going to see very, very dark corners. And in fact, one of the corners almost looks like it's covering the lens. Like it's not actually covering the sensor at all, sometimes. So yeah, when you stop it down to 2.8, it becomes more like what I would consider kind of a characterful vignette. And when you stop it down to kind of f4 and stuff like that, it becomes pretty adequate. But did you buy a 20mm f1.8 prime and suffer the massive inconvenience of a lens which is almost always too wide to use it at f4? Probably not. Like, you probably have a general purpose zoom or a slightly wide angle zoom that covers 20mm. And what are you gaining? I'm not sure. Okay, pros of this 20mm. It has a very unusual focal length and aperture combination. When it came out, this was the widest f1.8 lens. Like, it was more forgivable at the time because it was unique. There wasn't anything that did what it did. And for that, at my price range when I was looking, it still is. You're not going to find any other f1.8 20mm lenses which are even close to this. Like, this is, I paid £135 for my copy. I saw a review which said it's worth it, but don't pay too much. So I set myself the goal of getting it for under £150. There are ones on eBay for $250 and more. I don't think I could recommend it at that price. I'm not 100% sure I could recommend it at 150 quid to anyone who didn't know they already wanted it. So it's cheap, it's wide angle, and it's wide aperture. All of those things together make it nearly a unique proposition. And I think that has value. For someone who doesn't have £500 to spend on every lens they get, or any lens they get, what else are you gonna get? You kind of have to get this, if that's what you want anyway. The next pro is kind of a con, but it's a bit of a pro. So it weighs around 500 grams. It's not a light lens, and if you compare it to something like the 24mm Pancake Prime for APS-C, again, comparing it as an APS-C lens, I know it's a bit wrong, but I have that one, and they're around as sharp at f2.8 as each other. Probably the Canon is sharper, but that one weighs nothing, it's this big. So you're probably not going to use them as comparable walk-around lenses. 35mm is a very popular focal length, and I can see why you would want to have a wide aperture 35mm equivalent for an APS-C, but even though this one goes wider, I don't think it's justifiable in terms of weight. Very, very similar price, and anything else really. Yeah, it's light compared to its full-frame competitors. If you look at the Sigma f1.4 Art version, which is essentially the successor to this lens, that weighs nearly a kilogram. That's a lot of heft. You probably aren't ever going to use a kilogram 20mm fixed length as a walk-around lens. That's basically just going to be used for specialty uses. I can't imagine anybody using that as a walk-around. Nikon actually do a lighter version, which is just under 500 grams, f1.8, 20mm. Obviously it's Nikon only, so it didn't even factor into me because I have two Canon cameras, but it also will cost you about 500 quid to buy it now. So is it comparable? Yes, if you have the money and you have a Nikon. This you could get for Nikon, Canon, you can adapt it to Sony, you can adapt it to, you probably can't adapt it to Pentax. You might be able to get a Pentax version, I don't know. Nobody has Pentax, so it doesn't matter. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to chuck the 20mm onto the 90D and show how it behaves as a video lens, particularly using dual pixel autofocus. And you're probably going to hear the autofocus, so we're not going to keep this one very long. Listen to that. One thing you will notice about this lens when it pulls back and forth, if you watch me run away, is that it has almost no focus breathing. Did it do it? Yeah, you should see that really the size of the frame doesn't change very much, which is good for video. If you were to flip it into manual focus and just rack that focus round, it's quite, you know, it's quite smooth. It's quite nicely damped, so you could focus it, and you would get, I think, adequate results given that it's such a wide angle. If you stop it down a little bit, like right now we're at f4, we widen it wide up to f1.8. Ooh, and nice and bright. If you have this stopped down, right now we're at f3.2. This lens is going to be quite possible to use for video. It's nicely damped. It's wide enough to mean that stuff is kind of going to be in focus when it's stopped down a little bit. You're not going to have to worry about that too much. It's also pretty good for focus breathing, so like I said, you're not going to find it changes your framing too much. It has its values. It does have this weird push-pull clutch, so you have to flick the switch for the focusing, and you also have to pull the focus barrel thing back and forth to engage or disengage with the motor. If you don't do that and you put it in autofocus, it's going to autofocus and move the barrel thing around, and it makes an awful noise and it sounds like it's going to die. So I don't think your lens is going to last very long if you do that. Wouldn't recommend it. It's deeply flawed, has a bit of character, and ultimately if I wasn't into wide field astrophotography, I would not have bought it. Should you? Obviously that's up to you. If you do, don't pay too much for it. This is in nearly perfect condition. I got it with the original lens pouch and everything for £135, like I said. That is, I can't imagine you're getting one for much less than that. If you do, congratulations, that's great. Don't tell me, please don't tell me. It's also not super wide, like a 16mm I think is where you really get to like, whoa! Anything wider than 16mm is like absurd. 20mm is like, whoa, that's pretty wide. Like you get in here and you go, whoa, that's a lot. And like just from here, the camera looks tiny in this shot. But it's a little bit lost in the middle ground if you really wanted an ultra wide. It has a pretty nifty minimum focusing distance, so you can actually get some pretty wild shots really close up to stuff, even though you still don't get that close to it because it's actually kind of pushing everything away because it's so wide. So it does and it doesn't work as a macro lens, but you can get insane amounts of subject separation at that point. So I mean, you can see some of these shots, like it's razor thin at f1.8 in f2.8 because you can go so close and you're so wide. So you can get some interesting shots. I don't think you'd ever want to use it for portraits, it's too wide. It's a lens, you can get it if you want. Yeah, if you have been watching, thank you for watching, and probably don't check out the rest of my videos because they're nothing like this. But hey, see you next time if I ever make another one. Bye.